Good morning, teachers. Today we're going to take a look at the way that I go about teaching aggregate supply. So we're going to go over a brief video lesson plan on the AP Macroeconomics Unit 4, Lesson 3, Intro to Aggregate Supply. So there's a couple of ways I want to go about doing this. Probably the most important and confusing thing for the kids to understand is that whereas in microeconomic supply and demand there was one supply curve, in macroeconomic or aggregate supply and demand there are two separate and unique supply curves that will move independently of each other, at least relatively independently of each other. So the first big question that I like to lead off with to kind of guide the students' understanding is to go over why that is. So big question number one is, why are there two aggregate supply curves? The short version of this story is that there's two aggregate supply curves because depending on what's happening to wages in the economy, changes in the aggregate price level, aka inflation and deflation, will impact overall productivity in different ways. So the short-run aggregate supply curve, represented here in blue, shows how inflation impacts GDP when wages are sticky. And so what it means to have sticky wages is that when the aggregate price level changes in our economy, wages don't automatically adjust for those changes in the price level, right? So it might be 2 or 3 years in between workers getting a raise, whereas the aggregate price level in most market economies is constantly increasing by a certain percentage. So this year, I might make the same number of dollars that I made last year, but prices are always constantly changing. So there's going to be a slow march up of prices in a market economy, but wages don't immediately keep up with that, those changes in the aggregate price level. Eventually, workers are going to notice that they can't buy as much with their wages as they used to be able to, but depending on how quickly inflation is increasing, that might take years. So in the short run, at least, increases in the aggregate price level create a net benefit to the producers of goods and services. The reason being that because in the short run wages are sticky, and by the way, we live in the short run, so we're pretty much permanently in the short run. Because wages are sticky in the short run, this allows producers to raise the prices that they charge consumers for goods and services without also raising the wages they pay their workers. Resulting in higher levels of profitability and, according to the short-run aggregate supply curve at least, higher levels in overall productivity because of those higher levels of profitability. So these producers see themselves able to squeeze a little extra value out of their workers by charging the customer more but not paying the worker more, and they take advantage of that by increasing overall productivity, which is why the short-run aggregate supply curve has that upward slope. Increases in the price level lead to increases in overall productivity because the producers are able to squeeze a couple of extra dollars out of any given unit of productivity. So to sum that up and to bring us back to where we're talking about with the short-run aggregate supply curve, because of increases in the aggregate price level, in the short run, nominal wages remain stagnant, they're sticky, but, and this is where you're going to want to go back and remind the kids from last unit about the difference between nominal numbers and real numbers. Even though nominal numbers are remaining the same, you're making the same number of dollars you did before. Because the aggregate price level has increased, what you're able to purchase with those nominal wages has fallen. So real wages in the short run fall as the price level increases, even though nominal wages remain the same. Then, at some point along the line, workers are going to notice that their real wages, their buying power, is basically eroding due to increases in aggregate price level and higher levels of inflation. At that point, and it could take a very long time for us to get there, those workers will either go to their bosses and demand higher wages, or they'll renegotiate contracts. And at this point, at some point in the future, those producers are going to have to adjust wages to keep back up with inflation, even though they really don't want to. So those workers are going to demand higher wages. Producers would rather not pay them, and they're going to get away with not paying those higher wages for a while. But at a certain point, workers are essentially going to win that battle, at least temporarily. And at this point, the economy is going to adjust to the long-run aggregate supply curve. So wages in the long run are flexible, meaning that those wages will eventually catch up with inflation, and that'll shift us from the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is in blue here, to the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is in red. Unfortunately for those workers, this victory that they've just won over the producers is going to be very, very short-lived, because immediately upon their wages adjusting for inflation, inflation the next day or the day after will continue to rise. So workers' wages will periodically catch up with inflation. Workers will get a raise to bring their real wages back to where they were before, but almost immediately upon winning that victory, they eventually start to fall behind again, and the whole process starts anew. And this is why I always tell my kids it's better to write the paychecks than it is to earn the paychecks, because those who earn paychecks, their earnings and their buying power are constantly being eroded by inflation. And even though they'll periodically keep up, the vast majority of their lives, 99% of the time we spend in the economy, those wages are going to be sticky, and they'll end up slowly but surely earning less and less and less when it comes to real buying power than they did the day before or the year before. So what we'll see happen when wages become flexible and adjust to the long-run aggregate supply curve is what we'll see in practice is a temporary reduction in overall productivity due to the fact that the producers are no longer able to squeeze a little bit of extra value out of every worker, because now they have to pay them fairly. And so you'll see, at least in the short term, a contraction of our GDP back to the level that it was before. So, what does all of this mean? Essentially, the big three takeaways that students need to have from this lesson are, one, that it's changes in wages, nominal wages specifically, that differentiate the short run from the long run. When nominal wages are fixed or nominal wages are sticky, we're on the short run aggregate supply curve. This is where we spend the vast majority of our time. And when nominal wages are flexible, we'll find ourselves, at least temporarily, on the long run aggregate supply curve. The second big takeaway that students need to come away from this lesson with is that workers' real wages are constantly eroded by inflation. So whenever workers find themselves on the short-run aggregate supply curve, where they spend 99+% of the time, every single day their real wages are falling due to increases in the aggregate price level coupled with no change in their nominal wages. So over time, workers' buying power is constantly eroded by inflation. It will periodically catch up with inflation, but then again is immediately eroded once more. The third, and probably most important takeaway from this lesson, is that due to those erosions of real wages, in the short run, there's a positive relationship between price level and our GDP. So higher levels of inflation are good for producers, and that results in increases in real gross domestic product. So that's good for producers, maybe bad for the workers, but it's the producers that determine the level of productivity. And so in the short run, higher inflation will lead to higher levels of productivity as those producers squeeze a little bit of extra value out of each hour of their workers' time. But in the long run, when those wages eventually catch up with inflation, productivity will go right back to where it was before. So the big takeaway here is that there is no long-run relationship between the aggregate price level and the level of real productivity of our GDP, although there is a short-run relationship between those two things that does not exist in the long run, because once those wages catch up with inflation, overall productivity goes right back to where it was before, and it's basically like the inflation never happened. Workers can buy the same that they did before, producers are producing the same that they did before, and so changes in the aggregate price level don't have a long-run impact on overall productivity. So the next big question we want to work with the kids on are specifically, what are the determinants of the short-run aggregate supply curve? We're going to differentiate determinants of short-run from determinants of long-run, because I think if we teach them on the same slide, it can be a little bit confusing. So keeping in mind that the short-run aggregate supply curve describes the period of time where nominal wages are remaining sticky. There's essentially four major things that will cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shock either to the left or to the right. Those things are going to be abbreviated CPR-N. That's the best abbreviation I could come up with. If you've got a better one, feel free to let me know in the comments. So the first of the major determinants, and probably the most common one that comes up on the AP exam, is commodity prices. You'll need to define commodities for the kids. These are going to be inputs that are generalized, so things that are used in the production of a lot of different products. And these inputs are bought and sold in large quantities. So we're talking about commodities, we're talking about oil or energy or water or lumber, steel, these types of things. So when any of these commodities goes up or down in price, it affects production costs for a vast chunk of the U.S. economy. And so when those production costs either go up or down, they're going to impact total productivity in the economy in the short run. The next of those is going to be productivity. This is predominantly going to be labor productivity. So if workers become more productive over the years, as they have in the United States for about the last 50 years in a row, just if each worker is more productive, they're going to produce more and aggregate supply is going to increase. The opposite would happen if workers for some reason become less productive. The one that really tends to trip up students is the R in CPR, which stands for regulation. And the reason it tends to trip up students is because there's a lot of different types of regulation here that they may not necessarily be familiar with. So you'll want to go ahead and list out what are the different types of regulation for them and talk a little bit about how each of these regulations is going to impact production costs, because at the end of the day, it's regulations' impact on production costs that impacts the short-run aggregate supply curve. So some of the common ones they'll see are going to be things like labor regulations. These would be things like working age or the minimum wage. You can also talk about labor unions and their demands for higher wages and better benefits here as well. Another would be the regulatory environment involving taxation. So this would be taxes and subsidies on large chunks of the U.S. economy. Those will certainly impact short-run aggregate supply. Trade regulations like tariffs and other barriers to trade either from us or from other countries will impact overall short-run aggregate supply, as will any kind of environmental regulation. So it doesn't really matter what the type of regulation is. Any regulation or regulatory environment that makes production more expensive is going to reduce short-run aggregate supply, and any regulatory regime that makes production less expensive is going to increase short-run aggregate supply. I might want to point out that isn't necessarily to say that regulation is bad. We try not to make value judgments in eco, but we will say that regulation tends to make economies less efficient and therefore results in lower levels of productivity across the board. The last of the major determinants of short-run aggregate supply are going to be changes in nominal wages. So producers, remember, short-run aggregate supply is coming from the producer's perspective. Producers don't want to pay high wages, they want to pay lower wages because that increases their profitability. So any change in nominal wages due to either governmental factors or due to just the natural ebb and flow of the labor market is going to impact overall productivity here as well. You do want to stress here this is nominal wages that are going to impact short-run aggregate supply. Real wages are going to have a totally different and unrelated impact here. So taking a look over here at the right, we can talk about what are the changes in each of those determinants that are going to cause what we call a positive supply shock, aka the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. When we talk about aggregates, we generally call them shocks as opposed to shifts. The AP exam will accept either one from the kids, though, so don't let that confuse them too much. So the changes that will cause an increase in short-run aggregate supply or a positive supply shock are decreases in commodity prices, increases in overall labor productivity, fewer or less costly government regulations, and lower nominal wages. Keeping in mind that just because these things increase short-run aggregate supply doesn't necessarily mean that these particular policies are always going to be preferable to the alternative when it comes to maximizing utility in society. These are just the things that are going to maximize productivity for this one sector of the economy. Below that, we'll see all the determinants that will cause negative supply shocks or short-run aggregate supply shifting to the left. The most common one of those that comes up on the AP exam is going to be higher commodity prices. This might be a really good point to start talking with the kids, if you haven't already, about the concept of stagflation. The kids need to know that when the short-run aggregate supply curve shocks to the left, due to an unanticipated increase in commodity prices, that the economy will experience kind of this weird scenario where we end up with high levels of inflation and high levels of unemployment, kind of the worst of both worlds, and that this phenomenon is known as stagflation. The example we always go to would be the United States during the oil shortages of the 1970s, so you can give that as kind of a real-world case study of what stagflation looks like. But they do need to know that higher commodity prices, especially unanticipated higher commodity prices, can lead to stagflation. In addition to that, we also have lower levels of productivity. This usually doesn't happen in modern economies, but there would be some corner cases where labor productivity becomes less productive, usually due to a war or due to a massive loss of kind of your physical production infrastructure. So things like a tsunami or an earthquake might lead to the average worker being less productive. More or more costly regulations or a less business-friendly regulatory environment would reduce short-run aggregate supply, as would higher nominal wages, either those higher wages coming through governmental actions or coming through the natural ebb and flow of the business cycle. So you may want to point out that when we're in recovery, eventually, as the recovery continues on and winds up, you'll start to see significant pressure on wages as lots and lots of workers get jobs, we get really near full employment, and producers have to compete through wages with each other for those workers. So it's not always government policies that are going to increase those wages. The natural ebb and flow of the business cycle will also lead to increases in nominal wages. Last but not least, we're going to move to big question 3. What are the determinants of the long-run aggregate supply curve? In order to understand the determinants of the long-run aggregate supply curve, I think the kids need to wrap their heads conceptually around what the long-run aggregate supply curve actually is. So long-run aggregate supply, because we don't exist in the long run and only very rarely reach the long-run aggregate supply curve, it exists mostly as kind of a theoretical exercise. So the long-run aggregate supply curve tells us how much productivity will the economy be having if it were always at full employment. Now, we're not always at full employment, obviously. So the long-run aggregate supply curve is basically the macroeconomic version of the production possibilities frontier, or the production possibilities curve, which is the very first model we introduced them to at the beginning of AP macroeconomics. So if they understand that, the long-run aggregate supply curve basically shows us where the economy would be producing if it were at full employment. That helps them to a little bit better understand that the long-run aggregate supply curve and its point where it intersects with the x-axis here actually tells us a variable called YP, which is potential GDP. And that's going to be defined as GDP at full employment, or at the natural rate of unemployment, if they remember that from the last unit. So, because the long-run aggregate supply curve is largely a theoretical exercise, and because it essentially is the same thing as the production possibility frontier, just on a much larger scale, the entire economy, as opposed to production of two products, the determinants for the long-run aggregate supply curve are the exact same determinants from the production possibilities frontier. So good news, bad news, if the kids still remember the production possibility frontier determinants, they already know the determinants of long-run aggregate supply. If they've forgotten them, here's another chance to get those right. So those determinants would be the quantity of productive resources available, the quality of productive resources available, or changes in technology relevant to production or productivity. So taking that knowledge and applying it to the determinants of long-run aggregate supply, we'll see increases in the long-run aggregate supply curve, aka a rightward shift, which shows economic growth, whenever the economy discovers more available resources or resources that are better suited for the production of products. So it could be more easily accessible resources. An increase in something like fracking technology would allow us to have access to better oil as opposed to more oil. Like, we knew it was there already. We didn't discover new oil, but we had easier access or less expensive access to it. So those things would cause an increase in long-run aggregate supply, as would the development of better productive technologies that allow each worker to produce more per hour. On the other hand, we would see economic decline or a decrease in long-run aggregate supply if we were to either run out of productive resources, so we'd have less resources available, or if we run out of the good productive resources and are forced to use resources that are a little less well suited for production, so harder to get or requiring more refinement. Or we would have lower levels of long-run aggregate supply if, for some reason, and this would be really uncommon, there was worse productive technology than there was before. I can't really think of a scenario where that would happen, but theoretically, if technology were to get worse, I guess we go through like a Middle Ages situation, that would hurt overall potential productivity in the economy as well. So hopefully that has helped to clear up some of what you need to know and what the kids need to know for short-run and long-run aggregate supply. I know this was kind of a long video, so thank you very much for sticking with me all the way through it. And I look forward to touching back on this topic in the next video, where we'll take aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply, smush them all together into one graph, and talk about overall economic equilibrium. And we'll hit on maybe some inflationary and deflationary spirals in the next video as well. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, go ahead and click on that next video. Thank you very much.